So there's this message in the Epiphany story that you don't have to keep living under the systems that control the way you live. There is still another way to organize your life, and that way is around King Jesus. So we're looking today in Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2 is the story of the Magi finding their way to Jesus. Starting in verse 1 in chapter 2, it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in the territory of Judea, during the rule of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem. They asked, where is the newborn king of the Jews? We've seen his star in the east, and we've come to honor him. When King Herod heard this, he was troubled, and everyone in Jerusalem was troubled with him. Now, there's two reasons why people are troubled here. King Herod is troubled because these Magi have come from the east not to honor him, but to honor something different, right? And so if you were an early listener, you would have known that King Herod was known as this kind of like insecure tyrant leader, obsessed with power, willing to do anything to hang on to power. So everyone in Jerusalem was troubled with him for different reasons, because there's what's King Herod going to do, right? He's losing power. How's he going to respond? So he gathered all the chief of priests and the legal experts and asked them where the Christ was to be born. Picking up in verse 7. Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and found out from them the time when the star had first appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem saying, go and search carefully for the child. When you have found him, report to me so that I may go and honor him. Lies, all right? That's no intention. King Herod has no intention of honoring this child. When they heard the king, they went and looked. The star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with Mary, his mother. Falling to their knees, they honored him. This is the first point in the gospel stories where we see people worship Jesus. And these men are from the east. They're not Jewish, but they're Gentiles. They're not from God's people, but they're from those people, those other people over there, the first ones to recognize Jesus as king. Then they opened their treasure chests and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Because they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod when they went back to their own country by another route. When the Magi had departed, an angel from the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod will soon search for the child in order to kill him. When Herod knew the Magi had fooled him, he grew very angry. He sent soldiers to kill all the children in Bethlehem and in the surrounding territory who were 2 years old and younger. That's why we wait to tell this story till after Christmas, right there. According to the time that he had learned from the Magi. After King Herod died, an angel from the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. Get up, the angel said, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. Those who were trying to kill the child are dead. So the book of Matthew, it's a piece of literature, right? And Matthew is primarily writing first and foremost to a Jewish audience. His goal is to try and convince Jews of something. He's trying to convince them of a bunch of things as the book goes on. But out of the gate, he's trying to help them see the difference between King Herod and King Jesus. That this king, King Jesus, operates in a different kind of power. He bestows power. He wields power in a very different way than King Herod. See, King Herod was born into power and was tasked by Rome to impose that power upon the Jews. King Herod is famously known for rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, except he did it by exploiting the labor of Jews, right? So he built the tower by exploiting the labor of Jewish people. He's the one, again in this story, who wanted every young boy killed. Why? Because of a perceived threat of a child, right? I mean, the ridiculousness of this, that a king would feel this insecure, right? He viewed power as something to be seized and defended at all costs. And so in the end, Herod's legacy is one of fear and death. that Herod has all along been remembered for his paranoia and his cruelty. His kingdom was temporary. It was tied to Rome and destined to fade. But King Jesus was born a refugee, and he was tasked with laying down his power on behalf of the Jews and eventually all people. And he did, didn't he? I mean, this is the story of King Jesus, that from Bethlehem to the cross, Jesus was consistently laying down his power and life for the sake of others. It's Jesus in the book of Matthew who teaches these kinds of things. He says, the Son of Man, talking about himself, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus also taught in the book of Matthew that the greatest among you will be your servant. Can you see how this comparison out of the gate wants the first listener to see there is a difference between the kingdom of Herod and the kingdom of Jesus? There is a different way, a different power when it comes to King Herod versus the power and the way of Jesus. Jesus' legacy in return is eternal. And he ushers in what the Bible calls the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. And he offers salvation to all who believe. Matthew's gospel is asking us to not just compare the kingdom of Jesus to the kingdom of Herod, but to compare the kingdom of Jesus and the kingdom of Herod to our own kingdom. To look at these two kingdoms and look at our own kingdom and ask questions, to reflect and consider what this epiphany of the incarnation might mean in our own lives. Are we building something temporary like Herod or eternal like the way of Jesus? In the literature here, Matthew is also, again, Jewish audience to start out, is referencing some moments from their past, helping these early readers understand something about Jesus by referencing something from the past. We read in this story about Herod goes berserk and wants all of these children killed because of his insecurity. This actually happens in the story before. Many, many, many years earlier, there was a different king in Egypt named Pharaoh. In the Jewish scriptures, you can read about this in the book of Exodus. Pharaoh was feeling threatened by God's people. Now, he had them in captivity. He had them as slaves, but they were growing in numbers, and so he ordered for all of the firstborn men to be killed, all the firstborn children to be killed. So right away, these early listeners of this story would have been cued to something that God had done in their past before. But that story is about a different baby, a baby named Moses, who also hid in Egypt from King Pharaoh, who also ended up being the liberator of God's people. So Joseph and Mary and Jesus hide in Egypt until that ruler is dead, in the same way Moses hid in Egypt until he could live into the calling that God had placed on his life too. See, in the scriptures, there's always been these two pictures, right? There's been this picture of Egypt where the powers and principalities of Egypt rule supreme. But then there's just been this picture of Jerusalem where the lands of Israel, well, while there was often in seasons powers and principalities that ruled those lands, God's people, for the most of history, were still allowed to worship in their land. They're still allowed to kind of have their practices. So in Egypt, they couldn't even have most of their practices. So in this land, God's people, again, if you follow the biblical narrative, were often infected by the powers of the day, like the way that world operated. But in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel, there's this picture that God's people had these practices. They lived in the practices God gave them, and they're able to resist now the ways of the rulers of that place. And so when Joseph and Mary are sent to take Jesus to Jerusalem to begin his journey, it's again this symbolism of God's people leaving Egypt where the powers and principalities of Egypt rule and going to Jerusalem where God's rule and reign can begin to be realized inside of God's people. So there's this message in the Epiphany story that you don't have to keep living under the systems that control the way you live. Does that sound relevant today? You don't have to keep living under the systems that control the way you live today. There is still another way to organize your life, and that way is around King Jesus. Fair enough? But then there's the Magi, and that's who I'm supposed to talk about today, right? So these Magi, they follow this star to Jesus. And I think Magi are maybe a little bit difficult for us to understand today. I don't think anybody here, when I ask you what you do for work, tell me you're a Magi, all right? This is like not something we hear a lot about today. Magi of the day were kind of this unique combination of like astrologers / dream interpreters / spiritual directors. Like people would come to the Magi with a problem in their life or something they were confused about and say to the Magi, can you look to the stars? Can you interpret these dreams? Can you give me some answers? Can you help me figure out what I need or what is going on? Can you give some clarity to my life? Now, judging by the gifts that these Magi brought to Jesus and their access to King Herod, I would impose that these Magi, they weren't just your run-of-the-mill Magi. These guys were pretty good at their jobs, right? They were pretty good at their jobs. These were some very good Magi. And what's interesting about this story is they follow this star to Jesus, that this is a career-altering moment for them. They would have waited their entire life for a discovery in the stars like this one. They would have waited their entire life for someone as powerful as King Herod to come to them with a problem that they could solve. And so when they encounter Jesus and they make the decision to bend their knee, to turn their bounty over to King Jesus, this is a life-changing moment. The trajectory of their entire lives changed forever. That they decide in this moment to give up their bounty to honor this child, then receive the bounty for turning him in. They've spent their entire life in pursuit of such a discovery, and they choose the prosperity of the baby over their own prosperity. And I think this sets up many, many stories in the Gospel of Matthew where people encounter Jesus and are invited to change the trajectory of their life. Over and over again, if you read the Gospels, people will encounter Jesus and they'll be invited to remain on the trajectory that they're living on or to change it. And here's what I want to say to us today. On this Epiphany, it is possible to call the trajectory of your life into question. It's possible. You're allowed to look at the trajectory of your life and go, that's not who I want to become. The direction of my life right now is not the kind of person I want to be. The trajectory of my life right now is all built around me, or built around my family, or built around my spouse, or built around my kids, or built around my job, or built around my country, and I don't want to live that way. I want to build the trajectory of my life around something else. Now, to be explicit about this, the Epiphany story and the Gospels are going to try to convince you to build that trajectory around Jesus, but that is certainly your choice. In Matthew's Gospel, he wants the reader to see that there is a choice involved in following Jesus, that you can choose to invest your life into the eternal rather than other systems or the temporal. And it's not just for the Jews. It's not just for the religious people. These Magi from the East were not Jewish. It's not just for the people who come from the right families, who know how to speak the right things, who have read all the books of the Bible. It's not just for the people who have their life together, or those kinds of people over there on Instagram or TikTok who are really good at changing their lives, right? We all follow them and feel terrible about our lives, right? Look, they change everything all the time. Their body changes every 3 weeks as their muscles get bigger. They change their diets. Like, it's not just for those people. But the Jesus of the gospel invites anyone to assess the trajectory of your life and consider if you'd like a change.